The book of Ecclesiastes is a book that has challenged interpreters ever since it was written, and the history of its interpretation is something you know a little bit about, having done your reading. I'd like to talk with you a little bit today about a way of looking at the book that you will not have read about, and I'd like to put it out there for your consideration. As we look at the beginning of the book, after the header, which starts out the words of Kohelet, the son of David, a king in Jerusalem, after that header, which was not originally part of the book. So, in other words, the first line of the original book begins this way. Havel havalim amar Kohelet, havel havalim hakol havel. Vanity of vanities, said Kohelet. Vanity of vanities, everything is vanity. Now, that is the first line of the book, and if you turn over to, and I hope you have your Bibles as we're looking at this, to the 12th chapter, verse 8, you get almost exactly the same words. Havel havalim amar Kohelet, hakol havel. Vanity of vanities, said Kohelet. Everything is vanity. Now, that is an ancient literary device to start a section and end the section with the same or virtually the same line is what we call technically an inclusio. And an inclusio was a method for the ancient writers who dealt in a time when there were no chapter headings, there were no chapter numbers, there were no verse numbers, any of that. It was a way for them to communicate structure and thereby to help their readers to divine the meaning of the text. Well, what we have here is an inclusio that indicates the beginning and end, evidently, of the original text. So that would entail actually, that what follows in the book of Kohelet or Ecclesiastes, that is 12 verses 9 through 14, is actually an addition to the book, probably added by somebody else besides the original author after the book had already begun to circulate. And I want to suggest to you that if we look at these verses, that actually emerges as a very probable conclusion, and furthermore, an analysis of these verses helps us to understand how the readers of this book, in the time it was composed, thought it ought to be understood. And that then is a guide to our own analysis and understanding. So I'm starting at verse 12:9. I'm working from the Hebrew because I don't believe there's an English translation that really captures the points I need you to get from the text with me. So I will translate as we go along. I'll also read in the Hebrew, so you just kind of get the feel of it. Sometimes that's just kind of nice to get the sense of what's going on and to hear it. So 12 verse 9. ויותר שהיה קהלת חכם עוד לימד דעת את העם ואיזן וחיקר תיקן משלים הרבה. And the first word is vioter, which I would translate moreover, or in addition, or P.S. We are dealing with a section that tells us by its very word, the first word, that this is an addition, because the Hebrew word means and addition. So this is an add-on to the book. And in addition, Kohelet was wise. He taught wisdom to the people. And he weighed, and he delved into, and he corrected Proverbs, a good number of them. That was quite a literal translation, just to give you a sense of things. So this is a portion added by somebody who's explaining, notice this, who Kohelet was. We have to assume then that there were people who were asking that. Why were they asking? Because the book is iconoclastic. If you read this book, it runs contrary to the grain of traditional wisdom in ancient Israel and in the ancient Near East as a whole. Therefore, it needed a kind of apologetic, somebody to explain who the author was and why he was okay, that he wasn't, in fact, what might have seemed like the ancient equivalent of a heretic of some kind. So he says that Kohelet, which simply means the teacher, was wise, and that he taught wisdom or knowledge to the people. And the next three words are very important for understanding what the book is about. Three verbs, v'izain, and he weighed. Weighed what? He weighed Proverbs. V'chiker, and he delved into or sought out what? Proverbs. And tikain, and he corrected or adjusted the same thing, Proverbs. So what this author thinks Kohelet was doing in the book that we're looking at is sifting proverbs that had come down to him by tradition, adding, as it were, his own comments to help us understand how to get value out of the things, or even to kick back against the traditional wisdom expressions. So he weighs them and finds, presumably, some of them wanting. If you read the book, it's easy to get that conclusion. He seeks their deeper meaning. He adjusts or corrects them. I want to suggest to you that this is the way to read the book. If you were to take this verse and go back from the beginning of the book and begin to try to mark out, okay, where do I think traditional wisdom is being expressed? In other words, kind of a quotation. And where do I think I'm seeing the author's, that is Kohelet's, reaction to it? I want to suggest to you that if you go back and take that approach, the book will open up. It doesn't mean that it will all fall into place easily. In fact, scholars have been arguing for a long time about how to divide the book up and whose voice we're hearing at what point in the book. The reason that that's difficult is that, again, there were no markers in ancient manuscripts indicating, well, here I'm quoting, or here somebody else is speaking, and I'm just referring to what they think. It's not my own words, not my own voice. We have to figure that out for ourselves. The ancients had that sort of understanding that they passed on orally for as long as there was a living connection. And when the living connection fell silent, they were in the same boat we are, trying to figure out who was talking and whose words they were dealing with. So in this book, then, Ecclesiastes, we have some words that are his own and some that are quotations from other sources, other authors, traditional wisdom. By traditional wisdom, I mean wisdom of the sort we find in the book of Proverbs in particular, which is of the sort that we have widespread in the ancient Near East, what I'm calling traditional wisdom. Verse 10. Bikesh Kohelet limtso divrei chefetz, v'chatuv yosher, divrei emet. We have to deal with the fact that the Hebrew of Kohelet is different from any other part of the Old Testament. I believe, myself, that the reason for that is that it falls into a time period when we have no other compositions in Hebrew from ancient Israel. I think the book is written sometime between 300 and 200 BC, quite late by some people's standards. But you will know that option from your reading. I'm not going to make a long argument for it at this point. But the Hebrew stands apart from what we have in earlier books, and essentially there are no later books. So this is of its own kind, and therefore we often have difficulties in dealing with exactly what he means. So let me just suggest to you, without trying to argue in detail for various meanings, an understanding of verse 10. Kohelet sought to find pleasing words and treasured writings, words of truth. That's simply a further explication of what we read in verse 9. Kohelet was seeking valuable things in traditional wisdom by analysis of it through the lens of his own life and experience. Verse 11. Divrei chachamim kadarganim ukamasmerot netuim ba'le asupot nitnu mero'e echad. Now this verse has a particularly difficult portion near the end of it that I think has arisen by means of textual corruption. That is, as the text was passed down by human scribes after the original, a single letter fell out. It was the letter B in Hebrew, and it fell out because it was two B's in a row. I'm inserting it back in to give you the reading that I just gave you in the translation, is this. The words of the wise are like goads and like nails driven into those who own the collections, all given by a single shepherd, capital S for shepherd. That's the Lord. So this voice in verses 9, 10, and 11 is trying to explain why Kohelet, the book, is worth reading and why it's got value. What that logically implies is that somebody was questioning the value of the book. You may know from your reading that the later rabbis had problems explaining some of the things in this book because they don't cohere with traditional understandings. I want to suggest to you that when the book of Kohelet first came out in the 3rd century BC, that it was controversial. And there were people in the city of Jerusalem, which is its probable origin, who felt that it was going too far, that it was a little too progressive, you might say, that it didn't give sufficient emphasis to traditional understandings of Torah and law and the life that the people had lived up until this point by tradition. So it was getting some resistance in the circles of the elite in the city. The author of these lines, the add-on to the book of Kohelet, is arguing against the resistance, trying to say, look, here's what we've got. It's valuable for the following reasons, and this is who Kohelet was. Logically, the person then who's writing these things was actually one of his own students. We have to imagine that Kohelet was a teacher in Jerusalem whose life was much like that of Jesus ben Sira, the author of the work known as Ecclesiastes, not to be confused with Ecclesiastes, who wrote around 180 BC, something like 100, maybe even as little as a generation, 100 years to a generation later than our author. So from the same basic general social setting, a teacher of wisdom, a student of the Holy Scriptures as they existed to that point. And our author made his living by teaching the children of the elite. Now there's controversy. He's put out his ideas, and some of the people in the city are resistant. One of his students is now arguing in favor of his points of view and of keeping the book, as it were, in circulation, because there are some who evidently want to censor the views. Then we start verse 12. And we have another voice, yet a third voice. So we've got Kohelet, we've got the student, and now we have somebody who's arguing against the student. And it starts off in verse 12 with that very same word that verse 9 started with, v'yoter, an addition, or and now also. So that's a signal that we're dealing with another point of view. So the book is kind of in a controversy, and the controversy is playing out in the additions to the end of the book, all of which have come down to us. And I want to suggest, by the way, that it's because of these additions that it was able to make it into the canon, past the objections of traditionalists. So, v'yoter mehema b'ni hizaher, asot svarim harbe, ein ketz v'laha harbe, yigat basar. So this voice, one might imagine, is something like a voice of an older man. Perhaps those people who are objecting to Kohelet, and the second voice, the one in verses 9 through 12, was a young man who had been a student of Kohelet now. Maybe even his father or somebody in that kind of role is responding. And he says, be careful of them, my son. I.e., keep yourself away from those kind of people that have these collections of wise texts and books. So now we have in verse 12 the father, as it were, or somebody in a similar role, the father of the first person who's apologizing for, i.e., arguing for Kohelet. He responds in verse 12, and he says, in addition, we're keyed off by that, in addition, my son, stay clear of them, keep clear of them, keep yourself safe from them. He means from those people who have those collections of books and who study those books and who spend their life weighing Proverbs and seeking the depth of them. Because he says, of the making of books, there is no end. And furthermore, a lot of study wearies the body. So this is a man who's practical. He says, look, it's like somebody who exercises too much. I mean, you do a certain amount of it, it's good for you, but you do more, and what is the point of it? You're just exercising in order to be able to do more exercise at that point. And you don't need to be able to do more exercise, so it's pointless. He doesn't see the value of a lot of time spent. He's not an intellectual. And the same voice, or somebody with a similar point of view, follows in verse 13. Sof devar hakol nishma, et ha'elohim yirah, ve'et mitzvotav shmor, ki ze kol ha'adam. Look, the end of the matter is this, okay, let's summarize. Everything's been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, because this is what a man's life consists of. Now, those words are impossible to conceive of as the words of Kohelet. Why, that statement goes against everything he's said in the book. It's not simply a matter of keeping the commandments and fearing God. There's all kinds of questions about the reality of the world we live in. We don't know for sure there's even life after death. And we don't know the value of wisdom beyond the fact that it's slightly better than foolishness. I mean, our author is full of questions. And this guy, this writer, is saying, you know what? Let's cut to the chase. It all doesn't amount to a hill of beans. Just fear the Lord and keep his commandments. But that traditionalist point of view would have been very pleasing to precisely those people who would have found the book of Kohelet most objectionable. And so in verse 14, Ki et kol ma'aseh ha'elohim yavi b'mishpat al kol netlam, im tov im ra. For every deed God will bring into judgment concerning all that is hidden, whether it's good or bad. So the reason to keep God's commandments is that there's coming a judgment day. The author of this text, verse 14, perhaps the same as the 12 and 13, perhaps another voice, believes that there's a life after death. There's a judgment that's coming. And it is a motivating force for keeping the commandments of God. That is not something that the author of Kohelet would have written, because he doesn't know that there is an afterlife. You may recall he's talking about the fact that we go down into the dust just like animals when they die. And who knows if there's anything more, he says. So all of this has just been an attempt to give you a way to think through the book. Not the same way that you were told in your readings. A way to think about the book that may be helpful. And I would suggest to you that it would be worth your while to go back when you get a time at some point and read the book through with the idea of trying to weigh out the Proverbs. Where's the traditional wisdom? Where are the words of Kohelet? What does he think? If you do that, you'll understand the book better.